our keynote session with Paul Nemitz. For those of you who are just tuning in, I'm Ayisha Piotti. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of RegHorizon. Now, as a reminder to the audience, Paul's keynote will last about 30 minutes, after which we will open the floor for a short Q&A session. So please do post your questions in the chat and we will try to answer as many as possible during the allocated time. Now, Paul has an impressive resume. Paul is the principal advisor in the Directorate for Justice and Consumers at the European Commission. Prior to this, during his 6-year appointment as Director for Fundamental Rights and Citizens' Rights in the same directorate, Paul led the reform of the data protection legislation in the EU, the negotiations of the EU-US Privacy Shield, and the negotiations with major US internet companies on EU Code of Conduct. He's a member of the Commission for Media and Internet Policy of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, and a visiting professor of law at the College of Europe in Bruges. In addition, Paul is also a member and trustee of various boards and institutes in Germany, but also in the US. Now, the topic of Paul's keynote today is very inspirational and very relevant, I think, also based on what we have been hearing all this time during the conference. And the topic is democracy and the rule of law in the age of AI. Paul, it is my great pleasure and honor to have you on board with us today, and we look forward to hearing your views. So without any further delay, I would like to pass the floor to Paul Nemitz.
Thank you very much for the kind words of welcome, and I'm very happy to speak to you today. The ETH Zurich is a competence center on artificial intelligence, and therefore I also look very much forward to our discussion. The issue of technology and democracy, of course, is at the heart of what engineers should be thinking about, because engineers are, as citizens, participants in democracy. Engineers are much less active in democracy, if one can believe the statistics, than they have been, let's say, in the 60s and 70s. In fact, the relative number of engineers in parliaments has declined both in Europe and in the United States. And that's why in my book Prinzip Mensch, Macht, Freiheit und Demokratie im Zeitalter der künstlichen Intelligenz, in English one would say the human principle, power, democracy and freedom in the age of artificial intelligence. At the end of the book, I recall the great studies of the responsibility of engineers by Eugen Kogon, a German sociologist who became famous by his studies of the concentration camps of the organization in Auschwitz. And he made his task after the war to educate engineers in political science, in democracy, in history, so that something doesn't happen again what Adorno famously in his 1968 article on the future of education after Auschwitz described as the technical intelligentsia in the Third Reich, building great trains and laying the tracks, and the engineers, building the perfect railway, but not asking what happens at the end of the railway track. So when I talk to you at the ETH Zurich today, I would like to recommend to you the reading of this 1968 text of Adorno. If you read it today, it is as relevant as it was in 1968 to the relationship between individual freedom, responsibility for fundamental rights, democracy, and the skills and tasks of the engineer. Today, of course, with artificial intelligence, the challenges are in a certain way very different. Artificial intelligence is a technology which allows to develop programs which themselves can mutate, which themselves can further develop, but more importantly, artificial intelligence deployed via the internet can reach every individual in our society. So artificial intelligence combined with the reach of the internet and combined with the collection of personal data becomes really a technology of mind, a technology of potential domination and control of people, and a technology which allows governments to hurt the people in a way which really was inconceivable still 2 decades ago. And this ability to hurt people, to control them, and actually to make them want certain things is, of course, not only an attempt or an assault on individual dignity, but it also undermines the good functioning of democracy, which of course presupposes that we are able to decide and use our reason, and that we do this based on a view of the world which is the real world and the real view, and not a view which is already pre-cooked by powerful algorithms which control what we see and therefore shape our opinions. And indeed, this is all very relevant to democracy also because 50% of citizens in Europe and also the United States today build their opinion on the internet. Thus, they build their opinion in a worldview which is mediated via algorithms which probably use artificial intelligence. I have had a lot of discussions of multidisciplinary nature. In fact, I believe that the great scarcity of today is not the one great new idea, the one great new paper, or the one great book, but it is the ability to agree. And the ability to agree both domestically in our countries, in our states, on rules to frame technology, and even more important, or even more difficult certainly, the ability to agree across the Atlantic on such rules. And why is it so important to reinvent and regain our ability to agree? Well, because without the ability to agree, democracy doesn't work anymore. And the ability to agree requires democratic engagement, because only through democratic engagement people learn how hard it is to agree, but also how to agree. And we do not only live in a world which is very much characterized by individualism of a consumerist nature, but also in many of the technical professions. Of course, group work is important, but let's say, individual skill of getting things done, of building things, is preached, and getting things done in a technical matter is a very different thing from getting things done in a societal context. What do I mean by this? Let's take the difference between human language and the code. Very often in the debates on law, on making rules for technology, there's an implicit criticism and discontent with human language to be heard. One of the key slogans of technology companies against laws is, we either want a good law or we want no law. And what do they mean by a good law? They mean a law as it is a fantasy in the engineering view of the world. A law which can be machine implemented. A law which can be understood by machines and basically doesn't need humans to implement anymore. So basically, what they would like to see is the code as law. Now, I would say that is a fundamental misunderstanding of how democracy works. Democracy needs us humans to deliberate. We need to talk with each other. We need to understand each other. We need to use human spoken language. And we need to negotiate compromises. No law can be up to scientific standards. No law can be mathematically precise, because by the very nature of things, democracy always means compromise. For example, when we negotiated the data protection regulation in the European Parliament, we had over 4,000 amendments. All of them needed to be discussed, and on all of them, a compromise or a vote had to take place. That's the reality of lawmaking today, and it probably wasn't very different in democracies in the past. But the law also has other advantages over code. Today, we receive every 8 weeks or every 3 months an update on our mobile phone. Why? Because the code is written for stupids. Who are the stupids? The stupids are the machines, the computers. They can't think for themselves. If something goes wrong in the mobile phone or also in more complex computing environments, it's the code which must be worked on. The human language of law, on the other hand, is addressed to humans who can think themselves, who are able to reinterpret the text of the law as technology and business models evolve. What we need today is technology neutral law. And it is a fallacy to say that the law has to develop as fast as the code. This is again one of those slogans by the tech industry, which I would say is even anti-democratic, because no parliament is able to constantly update this or that technology-related law. The opposite is true. The best laws are the most enduring laws, and those are the constitutional level laws. They may hold, like in the case of the United States Constitution, hundreds of years and still be relevant.
That's fascinating remarks so far. Okay, we've got you back.
Okay, so what I'm just saying is to the engineers in the audience, hopefully there are some, the scarcest resource is the ability to agree, and to agree on what? To agree on rules, and rules need human language. We need deliberation. We need to understand each other. And this is a fundamentally different process than the process of building code or building technology. And I'm just pleading for some engagement of the technical intelligentsia also on that side of things, namely in the democratic process for rulemaking. Why? Because on the one hand, those who make the rules on technology, which are the legislators, they need to benefit from the input of those who know the technology. So it's very important that people are willing to explain not only how the technology functions, but also how they see the risks of technology as they may relate to fundamental rights of humans. It's not only data protection, it's also free will or discrimination and all these issues which are discussed in relation to AI. Lawmakers also need to understand just the general potentialities of these technologies. For example, how close are we to artificial general intelligence? How much do we have to worry about books like Stuart Russell's, the problem, human compatible, the problem of control, or like the recent articles by Iyad Rahban from the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, one of the directors there, former MIT professor, who writes with many colleagues also from the mathematical science that a technological control, a mathematical or algorithm-based control of AI programs is actually not possible. So how much do we have to worry about statements like those of Nick Bostrom? The general artificial intelligence may well have been our last invention. How much do we have to prepare for a moment where artificial intelligence could take rule over humans. And to be very clear, I do believe that such a moment needs to be avoided at all costs. And we have to prepare, we have to put measures in place in this world of very fast moving technology to avoid that this tipping point is reached and we may go beyond it. And as Stuart Russell in his book, Human Compatible, The Problem of Control writes, and Stuart Russell is an engineer coming from the computer science side, when in the last century, there was a debate about whether the atomic power could be developed. And there was a very broad consensus that it was not possible to split, the elements of the nucleus which made atomic power. And one day later, the formula was found how to do it. What he says basically, we cannot be sure that such a moment is not around the corner. It doesn't look like it. It looks like it's still decades away, but who knows? And so I would say, when we discuss today about rules on technology and in particular AI, we need to remember that we have developed in philosophy and law what is called the precautionary principle. If we have uncertainty as to the future, but we cannot exclude that the future holds huge risks for humanity, we have to take the decisions today to avoid and mitigate those risks of humanity in the future, even in the long term. This is a principle developed by the philosopher Hans Jonas in his 1979 book, The Principle of Responsibility. And it became primary law in the European Union through the principle of precaution, which of course in the beginning was developed in environmental law to avoid long-term damage to the environment, from atomic power wastes, and now we are, of course, in the climate change debate. But I would say when we think about this powerful, all-purpose and all-pervasive AI technology, and certainly the visions of the all-pervasiveness of this technology, we have to start looking at what this principle of precaution means, in particular relating to our ability to continue to live in democracy, to benefit from fundamental rights, and to be subject to the rule of law in terms of democratic laws and not just the rule of code. So these are the themes which, let's say, underlie much of the thinking of the legislative proposals which are on the table in the European Parliament and the Council. When you look at the legislative activity of the European Union in Brussels, you see a plethora of legislative proposals. The Digital Markets Act, which strengthens competition law to address the huge dominance of some of the technology firms. Since I published my book, the value of Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple has doubled again. It's really amazing how even through the COVID crisis, these companies became even more capitalized and more rich. And their combined value now of these 5 companies is the combined value of the German and Japanese economy taken together. So we're dealing here with a huge economic power. But we also have, let's say, functioning problems of platforms generally. Platforms are not only marketplaces, they are increasingly relevant to democracy, and this is what the Digital Services Act is about. It is to make sure that platforms function well as markets, so that there's no self-preferencing, but also as a forum for building opinions. And so the platforms of today, they are a little bit like the marketplaces of the past, where both commerce was done, but also the chatting took place on, what do we think of the king. And so marketplaces often have these double functions, and it's not different in our times of today. And then we have the Digital Governance Act, which brings us a little bit closer to AI, in the sense that its purpose is to create intermediaries which are independent and which aggregate data in such a way that others can use this data to develop AI programs for public good or for profit. And the aim of this legislation is to create such intermediaries for Europe so that data can be better aggregated, like, you know, banks aggregate money. They have a double function. They serve you in hopefully managing your money well, but they also aggregate the money for giving credit or investment into the markets for business. And the same should be the case with these intermediaries who hopefully manage your personal data better, maybe are able to monetize it or give you better services. In any case, hopefully these intermediaries would have a better negotiating position towards the big platforms in comparison to the individual who has absolutely no negotiating position whatsoever. And on the other hand, like a bank, in the aggregation of the data and anonymization also, where necessary, would provide this service for public interest and business. And then, of course, we have the AI Act on the table, which addresses this issue of risks from AI, not only the safety risks, the classic engineering risks. These are the risks every engineer learns about, and there are great methodologies in engineering to mitigate and avoid these risks. And we have come very far there. You know, if you think about how airplane security and safety today is guaranteed, it's very sophisticated science. But there's a new type of risk, which is, you know, the what I would describe as, of course, on the one hand, the sustainability risks, the risk related to environment, which is also closer to engineering, but further away, the risks for technology compromising fundamental human rights, constitutional rights, and the good functioning of democracy. So the AI Act basically sets out a risk pyramid of 4 categories of risks for AI and a mechanism of, let's say, implemented responsibility for those companies which put AI on the market to determine in which risk category they are, and then to take the related measures. And there are some common ground rules, and I would like to mention one which is very close to my heart, which is that humans always must know whether they are communicating with another human or whether they are communicating with a machine. We live in a time in which the technology makes it possible to have voice which really sounds like human voice, or have messaging or texts which look like humans have written them. But it is very important that humans cannot be manipulated by machines which are impersonations, or at least don't make transparent that they are machines. It's a matter of human dignity and freedom and individual self-determination, but it's also a matter of a good functioning democracy. You see, when we come closer to elections and in the morning you look at your mobile phone and you see all these messages which say, oh, this or that candidate is great, you need to know whether these messages come from humans or whether they are machine generated. If you don't know this, the process of societal deliberation in democracy and then leading to elections cannot work anymore. So I think, you know, that's one of the many principles which we hope to put in law in this regulation. And what we're doing in parallel is we're having a new intensity of dialogue with the United States. At the summit in Brussels, when President Biden visited Brussels in June, it was agreed to set up a Trade Technology Council in which we look at all aspects of technology regulation. And certainly the atmosphere in the United States has changed a lot under Trump, and also under Obama. There was huge hostility against the proposals from the European Union on technology regulation. America was still very much captured by John Perry Barlow's declaration on the independence of cyberspace, in which John Perry Barlow, and you have to read this once, you know, very poetic language. He was the texter of Grateful Dead, the band, set out a declaration of no legitimacy for democracy and for parliaments on the cyberspace and on the internet. And that was still, let's say, the underlying doctrine. But things have changed in America. I think America has woken up not only by the storm on the Capitol, but I would say the problem analysis with untempered technology and business interests, running the internet and the related technologies has been identified in America as much as in Europe. In fact, I would say often American science is more critical, more inquisitive, and also American press really still works very well, has a lot of stories uncovering abuse and technology going overboard, and also the corporations which finance the technological development not playing a ball by the rules. And so what is new now after the election of President Biden is that we have a much more constructive discourse across the Atlantic. One early precursor of maybe a more harmonious way forward and maybe an increased ability to agree is the Transatlantic Reflection Group on Democracy and the Rule of Law in the Age of AI. I think your conference organizers have made available to you, or can make available to you, this manifesto, this consensus manifesto written by this multidisciplinary group, which I have put together with Konstantinos Karachalios, the norms, the standardization director of the IEEE, an engineer, and in which we really had an open start, wanting to identify the issues of, let's say, where technology on the one hand and democracy and rule of law on the other hand need to be brought in harmony, let's say, in a new holistic vision. And we were able not only to identify those areas, the title is referring to AI, but it's also about, let's say, corporate power, competition, and the internet, and so on. And we were able to identify those areas, but we also were able to identify, let's say, a common thread, and to really agree on a manifesto, which I would say 5 years ago would have been still impossible. And a manifesto which very clearly returns to the principle of the primacy of democracy over technology and business. It's a very important principle that if you want democracy, it's the democratic process which has to decide the important things. We cannot hand over our societies to John Perry Barlow's idea of, the unbroken internet and the untouched technology and the unregulated cyberspace, or for that matter, ideas like singularity and transhumanism. So technological solutions should not replace democracy. There must be a primacy of democracy. And we need to empower our citizens through institutions of countervailing power. And when I talk about power, I mean also the technological power. We need to check on technological power in this new world. It will be a central function of the state, certainly, to check on technological power. But it is also a job of academia, including the engineering faculties themselves, and of civil society. We need the state's function is to empower and make possible countervailing power from different sources. And by the way, one, of course, very important countervailing power in a democracy, checking on power both of the state and of corporations, and in the future also of technology, is journalism. That's the fourth estate for that reason. And in the United States, we already have a school which is called Tech Accountability Journalism. Very famously, if you want to get into this a little bit, Julie Angwin, a former reporter of the Wall Street Journal, set up her own newsroom called The Markup. And her staff is 50% engineers, 50% journalists. And together in this newsroom, they hold to account the big technology companies with technological knowledge, and also with technological means, with their own systems of data analysis, for example, checking whether what is said, what the company is doing, is actually happening within their algorithms and within their platforms. So we must start to build bridges again between technologists and policy communities. It's very important that this comes from both sides. And I would also say we need to join forces across the Atlantic among all those who want to live in democracy and benefit from fundamental rights, in order to check on this incredible amassed power of the corporations, the GAFAM, basically. This power, the combination of technology plus money, is a huge threat to democracy, and competition. More competition in the markets is one way forward, but it's not the only way. We have many things to do, and the manifesto lists 17 tasks before us, which we need to work on to ensure that also in the technical age, democracy is vibrant and we live as free humans. We can use our own reason, and we can shape the world, not only through technology, with technology, but also in other ways, namely through our societal engagement in democracy, in civil society, in academia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. Very, very enlightening. Now, what I will do is that there is a question which actually relates to what I wanted to ask as well, and it's also coming from the audience. You talk about the great challenge is the ability to agree on rules, and democracy is going to be the one that guides us through that. And in the context of the transatlantic partnership and the sort of the Technology Trade Council, one question is about currently the US being so polarized as just a country. How do you see that panning out in the discussions going forward, specifically, integration of democratic values, fundamental rights, when the country is so polarized and people think so differently?
Yes, I think there are two issues on the ability to agree, and one is certainly domestic, and that's not only in America, but also in Europe. And, it's not a coincidence that we have found populism and increased, let's say, societies which are polarized all over the world in parallel to the change of the communication environment. I mean, to say it in short, if the only place of discourse is the screen of the mobile phone, the populist has a huge advantage, because the populist short message, this is all shit, vote Cinque Stelle, it fits on the mobile screen, but a differentiated message on how to solve the complex problems of society doesn't. So there is no golden bullet, but America shows us that a return from populism to reason, I would say, is possible. And, there's nothing which can be forced in terms of consensus. I'm just saying that we need to relearn, all of us, to go through democratic processes. And I would say to the programmers and, the technical intelligentsia, what grit is necessary to write a good code. And the same grit is necessary in democratic engagement. You have to stick with it over a long time and pursue the goals. And I think we need this engagement too. And I think the technological intelligentsia, the great engineers, they know what this requires. And I would in fact say the Green movement in Germany, the Green Party, is a perfect example of how a political movement can benefit from also, let's say, this discipline and grit of the engineers who are also used to work on their project for years and to stick with it.
Great. Now, another question which is very close to last panel, and we were discussing the notion of trust and trust in technologies, building trust in data. And I've been following a bit of what your beliefs are, and I believe that you are probably a bit skeptical about the notion of trust. And instead, should we be looking at citizens having the ability to be critical, to question? I mean, and how? What are your views on that? Because that's probably another way to go about it, rather than simply just trusting in technology.
Yes. Yeah, I must say, this idea that we have to build trustworthy AI, the language, I think, is the official language of the European Commission and of the high-level group on AI ethics. But I have to admit, me personally, the more I have thought about it, the more I have doubts. And this has to do something with the work on my book, where I discovered, the writing of many sociologists who already said in the 90s, the control of technological power will be a key function of democracy in the future. And I would also say the education for democracy in schools and universities must be an education towards a critical attitude. We must always have a critical attitude towards power, whether it's the government or whether it's private power, and that also applies to technological power. So my view would rather be that we have to extend the Frankfurt School of critical attitude into the future, and also related to technology. The more powerful the technology becomes, the more critical we must be to maintain freedom and democracy functioning. And, a critical attitude towards technology doesn't mean it's an anti-technology attitude. It is just the healthy attitude which make us citizens of democracy.
Very nice. I think I have a hand raised here from Hillary, so I'm going to probably unmute her. Oh, you can unmute yourself, actually, Hillary. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Paul. Very interesting, and I agree with all of your saying, and the manifesto is excellent. So my focus recently has been on trust and how governance of technology can be a contributor to allow the public to trust technology. So that's what that came in. But what I wanted to ask you, I like very much this idea of the primacy of democracy, and a lot of the work we're looking at is the empowerment of citizens and countervailing power. But one of the things that we know from, the history of, since the Universal Declaration, is that the power doesn't like citizens. So I had a great quote from someone the other day that power knows exactly what's going on. They're just trying to hide it. So how do you, literally specifically how? I hear lots of organizations in human rights, in privacy, all of these things, really running on a shoestring because no one will pay. And a lot of the ways to challenge power need money, and it needs coordinating, and everyone's doing it for free. So I would be interested to know, looking at some of your the things in the manifesto, who's going to fund these serious countervailing voices and allow and empower citizens to take a different approach to democracy? Because we know that this voting every 4 years doesn't get us anywhere, but there are lots of innovative routes to democratic engagement with technology that are out there. No one, again, willing to pay. So I just wondered if you had views on that and this context of who is going to pay to have this, the sort of the power imbalance sort of changed a little bit.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I think generally speaking, there are different schools of view on this. There are some, and this is more, let's say, it's sort of the American school, which is, well, society has to come up with the money for politics, and that's why there's no state funding for political parties, and there's very little state, compared to Europe, little state funding for universities. It's all privately funded, and you need to find a donator if you do NGO work. NGOs even refuse public money because the part of the critical attitude is not to take money from the state. And so, if you want to do public interest work in the US, you need to have a foundation or find a private person or corporations which bring you, which fund you, which have other issues. In Europe, that's different. We have many member states in the European Union where political parties are state funded. I think that's good. Political parties should not be only funded by big pockets from private money. And the same is true for public for universities. I think we have to be very careful that it doesn't become the best place to work in every university where Google or Microsoft fund the institute. This is unfortunately sometimes the case. If you look at the Google Institute, the Humboldt Institute of Internet and Society at Berlin University, very nice working conditions, much nicer than in the normal institute of the university, or for that matter, the Weizenbaum Institute, which has been funded by the German government much later for the same purpose. And the same is true for civil society activities. There are different systems of, for example, the European Union. We support some European organizations, head organizations of civil society. I think it's very important that in the end, civil society gets mixed funding, and that there's no dependency. That of course, we cannot have a civil society which is only funded from the state, but we can also not have it that civil society must sort of, bend and beg private donors. So there must be a good mix, and this is, the same issue. It's not only a money issue, it's also a time issue. So I think you are asking the right question. There's a huge imbalance in lobbying. Those who lobby professionally and who live from it, and especially those who work for these big corporations. These big corporations can afford endless lobbying and also endless litigation in courts. And that is something which creates an imbalance in what is heard in the democratic space. And that's why it's so important that we still have journalists who can put things a little bit into perspective, because if you only look at the internet, you get a completely wrong impression of the relevance and the weight of the argument, because it's controlled by these companies what you see on the internet. So in short, to keep a democracy vibrant, I would say, is a responsibility of democracy itself and the state. And the state cannot withdraw from the question of do we still have a good media landscape? Do journalists, as journalists, still able to do their job individually? Can they still work as the force, as state, and be critical to power? B, is our civil society able to be a counterweight? If not, what are we doing to make this happen? C, is the market still functioning? Or if not, what do we do to make it happen? All these questions need to be addressed, and they call for an active state, an active democracy, and in the end, a democracy which defends itself against those who don't like the citizen, who don't like democracy, who just want to run the shop either on simple slogans, that is populism, or based on technological beliefs, of the type of sentence that technology solves problems much better than the talking shop of democracy. There is a certain mutual enrichment from certain parts of the technology scene and populism, because what they have in common is talking down democracy and talking down the rule of law.
All right, thank you so much. I had about 4 and 5 other questions as well for you, but it looks like we're running out of time, and we have run out of time, and we're going to have to end it there. I just wanted to, just very last words, 1 minute. You're talking to the technology sort of experts, the students over here, and my one question there is, in order, what can you say for them to be incentivized to actually participate in the policy, discussions? Because in the end of the day, you talked about big tech, you talked about, they come with a lot of money, they come with a lot of incentives, and in the end, they can scoop up a lot of this talent. So how can we ensure that it happens? Because obviously it is extremely crucial. So maybe 1 minute on that, and we have to go to the next panel, but it was just incredible to listen to you. Please, last words.
I would say your life is much more enriched if you participate in one collective exercise where you learn how to agree with others on questions in a quasi or in a democratic process. And this can be an NGO, it can be, the board of the church, it can be a union, it can be a political party. It has entertainment value, I guarantee. It is a great social contact you make there. It's it may be very different people you meet there than in your working environment. So I would say it is actually fun and enriching for human beings, not to just bend to the pressures of work, not to just think of career and not to just stick in the family, but also to pursue one activity which goes beyond the individual and which is part of shaping our societies through personal democratic engagement in whatever context you choose for yourself to be most interesting and where you think you can contribute most.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul. So lovely to have you. Thank you. It's been short. I wish we had more time. So I just, on behalf of all of us here at ETH Zurich, as well as RegHorizon, thanks for joining. And I'm afraid we've run out of time and the next panel is starting now. So I believe I'm going to be, thank you. Bye-bye, Paul.
Bye-bye.